peace. Welcome to the C.L. Edwards Podcast, where we are reimaging the culture, focusing on spirituality, family, work, health, and community. Your host is author, speaker, husband, and father C.L. Edwards. Now, let's get it started.
So this is episode 10, picking up where I left off. I talked about my family of origin, struggling coming from West Africa to America, the South, coming up from the South up to the North, settling in Metro Detroit. And, eventually, like I said, my mom and dad went to the same high school, lived in the same neighborhood, and they met each other and fell in love, and they brought me forward. I was born and they got married. And from that point, we moved because my mother began going to college. My father, he was already working. My father started working when he was like 16 years old for the big three, for the auto plants. And so my mother, she got a scholarship to go to college. And we moved out to a college town, small college town. And that's where we grew up in. My mother and father, they were really big into fitness, into nature. We were vegetarians. Actually, it was a very good thing, very good setting. But, there were problems, there were issues. I remember, for what I can remember, being like 4 or 5 years old. For me, it was like heaven. It was like the greatest thing that ever happened. Having my mom and dad together, that was the best thing I could ever have thought about. But, just being a kid, not knowing what's going on behind the scenes, there were obviously problems because my parents ended up breaking up and getting a divorce. And I remember when things really started getting bad, breaking down, and seeing, my mother's side of the family and my father's side of the family arguing with each other. And see my mother and father yell at each other. It left a really hard imprint in my soul and inside my mind and my psyche. And when they got divorced, my mother being a college student at the end of her her degree, she couldn't afford to stay where we stayed at. She didn't have any money. She didn't even have a job yet. So we ended up having to move in with my grandmother in Detroit. Now, going from, public school in the suburbs, kindergarten, in a mixed environment, in a school, we had, I remember my kindergarten school, this is back in the 80s, we had Apple computers, And it wasn't like that in Detroit public schools. Far from it. It's a completely different environment. It was mainly it was entirely black. It was very underfunded. Schools didn't have everything you would expect a school to have. And a lot of students were underprivileged. And just living in my grandmother's neighborhood, I soon made friends. It was hard at first, but I adjusted as a young guy. And I made friends. But I remember, just the Detroit in the 80s. Wow. Detroit in the 80s, you had various different street organizations, as some people call them. Some people call them gangs. You had, 6 Mile LAs. You had the PAs. You had, 7 Mile Boys, 7 Mile BKs, 8 Mile Sconies, 8 Mile Smurfs. The Adidas, Pony Down on the east side. And various other groups and organizations. Detroit, basically every hood, almost every single neighborhood, there was a gang. You know, you go 4 or 5 blocks, you were in a different neighborhood, and there was a different organization that was in that neighborhood. And you know, as I got a little older in elementary school, I'm beginning to settle down. Like I said, I made plenty of friends, and I was looking forward to going to, you know, middle school and high school. And my mother decided she really didn't want me in this environment. You know, she didn't think it was a good environment for me to be in. She was afraid that I would get involved in, you know, criminal activity or be influenced negatively by the other kids in my neighborhood, which is, you know, I can understand why she would think that. You know, one of the other things that was going on at the time was that the crack epidemic set in. You're talking about the mid 80s, late 80s. So crack came in, and I clearly remember it. I mean, it was a drastic change. Even in my neighborhood, yeah, you had gangs. You had people who were using heroin, of course, alcohol at all times. But when crack came, it was completely different. The people changed. The kids changed. I remember the music, hip-hop music changed. So you had kids, maybe a little bit older than me, but we all played football in the street, played basketball. We used to go up to the baseball diamonds to play baseball. So I remember 87, 88, all that changed. Those same kids, they didn't have time to play football or basketball. And they had these little bads with these little, you know, cracked up pieces of crystal, like cracked up, it looked like cracked up split pieces of glass, dirty glass. That was crack, you know. And reality is, seeing the kids in my neighborhood, they were all selling crack. When you got into middle school and high school, you were selling crack. The chances probably would have been, if I'd have stayed there, I probably would have did the same thing also. So my mother moved us. I didn't like it because that was my neighborhood. That's where I felt safe. That's where my grandmother and my uncles and all my neighbors lived at. That was home. But we did move out to a suburb, and it was a completely different environment. We lived in a townhouse area, and there were some other kids, black kids. Actually, there was a kid from my old neighborhood who lived there, and we all made friends, and we did some of the same things we did back in the old neighborhood: play football outside, play basketball, hang out. But there was a lot of racism. I remember being just a little kid, being like 12 years old, just playing football, and some of the neighbors, you know, who weren't black, would call the police on us, you know, and we were constantly, just being 12, 13-year-old kids, being harassed by the police. Police would come up and ask us our names and ask us where we been and did we know about some crime. We were just little kids, you know. And this is around the time that NWA came out. I'm not going to say what NWA means, but, you know, and they came out with a song called F the Police. And that song was something we could relate to, even as 12, 13, 14-year-old kids. Because the police were constantly on our backs, harassing us, even started chasing us at one time. We weren't really doing it. We were just little kids, just like the other kids. The only difference between us and the other kids is that we were black. And that was it. And us being black mean we needed to be policed. We needed to be watched. We needed to be questioned and harassed at all times. And as time moved on, we ended up moving again. So this time my mother decided to move back into Detroit. And as we moved back into Detroit, I began going to high school in the city. Now, going from the suburb we lived in, even though it was a largely black school, probably about 70-80% black. Going to a high school in Detroit public school system, man, it was a big switch. We did stuff like, we used to sneak and smoke weed and drink beer, but nothing could prepare me for, going to high school in the Detroit public school system. It was like, they talk about the school to prison pipeline. I understand exactly what they mean, because the way they ran the high schools, it was almost like it was preparing you for prison. When you had to get into the high school, there were security guards and metal detectors, and you had to identify yourself. And then when you go in, there were police officers and security guards inside the school. In fact, my high school, we had a mini police station in the basement. And then there was all this violence. There were certain kids in the school that were clearly disturbed. They were clearly disturbed. They shouldn't have been in there. And they preyed on the other students, jumping students, threatening students, even robbing students, running their pockets. So this created an atmosphere of violence and fear, which is not is not the best environment if you're going to be learning. So learning was, it was about trying to survive, not trying to learn. Forget trying to, prepare for college or taking AP classes. You're trying to make it through the end of the day. And my mother, she saw that. She moved me to another school again, this time to a Catholic school. And I remember that, being taught by nuns and going to a Catholic service on Friday. In fact, it was in that environment where a nun actually assigned the class the autobiography of Malcolm X. And now this time I really wasn't doing good in school at this point. But it's something interested me about the book, because I heard about Malcolm X. I remember the Malcolm X movie coming out. So I was actually interested in the book. And once I started reading the book, I couldn't put it down. I had to read it towards the end. I read the whole entire book. And I think I read it in about a week, a little bit more, maybe 1 or 2 weeks. And I remember the teacher asked the class how many people read the book, and a lot of people in the class didn't read the book. And I was one of the few who said, yeah, I read the book. And, some of the smart aleck students were like, he's lying. And the teacher's like, no, I believe him. And it was true. I did read the book. And, there's certain points in your life where you can clearly see there's just certain points in your life where you have a paradigm shift. Where, it's marked out as there was a shift in your thinking. You learned something you didn't know. There was a change. That was one of the first points in my life, in my young life, where I for certain had a paradigm shift, because I could really relate to Malcolm. I related to his life and how he grew up, and then even his change, and his change in prison. It felt genuine to me. It was something I could relate to, and it actually, for the first time as a teenager, it gave me some type of hope, because the situation, what I'm looking at as a teenager, it looked almost hopeless. Nobody was doing anything with their lives. Nobody had any type of plan. People were people were graduating and going to prison, getting killed. There was no opportunity, it seemed like. And by this time, the auto industry in Detroit had completely tanked. So the one thing that people had, that they would go work for Ford or Chrysler or GM, that wasn't even a reality any longer. So if you're not going to go to college, you're not going to get a good job, you're not even going to get a blue collar job, then what is it? What hope is there for you? No wonder this time period in Detroit represented a high spike in crime, because there was nothing left there was no hope, there was no opportunity for anybody, for any of the kids. So of course you're going to have a school to prison pipeline. Now, continuing with this, reading the autobiography of Malcolm X is really the first time I got a real glimpse of Islam. I remember seeing the Spike Lee movie, but there was a lot of things in the Spike Lee movie I didn't understand. But when I actually sat down and read the autobiography, I was like, oh, it was like an enlightenment. Now I understand the things that were in the movie. And I became, in a general way, very interested in Islam. I admired Islam. I didn't really understand it, but I can say for certain that I admired it. Muslims were somebody in a general shape, people, even my peers, we looked up to. We saw them and we thought, we had respect for them. No matter what, even if people laughed at a woman wearing a hijab or covering up in the summertime or somebody with a beard, we thought it was strange, we still had a level of respect because we knew these were people who lived lives of discipline. They were serious. They had a purpose. They had a direction. They didn't engage in alcohol. They didn't engage in sets out of marriage. So we looked at that like, you have to admit that's a good thing. Those are all good qualities. Even in our society in general, we look at those qualities as being good qualities of a person. And to see somebody live that out in their everyday life, you have to admire that person. Also, the history in the civil rights era with Malcolm X himself and Muhammad Ali and the Nation of Islam. Islam was associated with justice, with seeking justice for the black struggle. It was associated with taking a stand and speaking truth to power. So on one hand, you got righteous living, disciplined living, speaking truth to power, standing up for justice. Of course, this is something that you admire, especially when you live in an environment where so many people are doing sins and doing negative things and doing wrong things and having bad outcomes. To see people, even if it's a small minority, that they live in the same place that we live. They live in the same environment that we live in, yet they live completely, totally different lives, and they have a completely, total different mindset. But still, I had been raised up in the church. I'd been raised up in church, even though I wasn't going to church by the time I was a teenager, but I had been raised in church. I'd been raised on the Bible. I mean, even as a little kid, I can say for myself that I was very religious. My grandmothers were very religious people. My mother took me to church. I grew up in the Baptist church. I would read the Bible as a little kid. I didn't have a choice. I would sit and watch Christian television with my grandmother, watching television shows about, the return of Jesus, peace be upon him, in the end times. That stuff fascinated me. But it wasn't until, I got 13 and I entered the puberty and I saw the other kids, they weren't into religion or anything like that. So I wasn't into it either. But reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, it was the first time that kind of pointed me back in that direction, kind of pointed me back to a straight path. And I didn't necessarily respond to it. I didn't become Muslim, but it put in my mind that there is an alternative. There's an alternative to the standard American lifestyle. I don't have to do what some people don't do what everybody does, and some people don't think the way everybody else thinks. So that's that. But we'll pick it up on episode 11, and we'll go from that point. Peace.
All right.